Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Noah paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the Noah paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence the knower is not known is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome. And the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The Noah paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes. But it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system without restrictions. That self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true. And that knowledge is transparent. If you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the Noah paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages, prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the Noah paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes. But it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the Noah paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The Noah paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, the principle that if you know P then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it, perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the Noah paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The Noah paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the Noah paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists, is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction. And the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The lottery paradox. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, and exactly one ticket will win, and you have not yet learned which ticket won. And now consider each individual ticket. Ticket number 1 has a 1 in a million chance of winning, which means it has a 999,999 in a million chance of losing. And this is overwhelmingly probable, so probable that it seems rational to believe that ticket 1 will not win. And the same reasoning applies to ticket 2, ticket 3, and every other ticket. Each has a minuscule chance of winning and an enormous chance of losing, and so it seems rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win. But now a problem emerges. If you believe that ticket 1 will not win, and you believe that ticket 2 will not win, and you believe this for each of the million tickets, then it seems you should believe that no ticket will win, because belief is generally thought to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P and you believe Q, then you should believe P and Q. And by repeated application of this principle, if you believe of each ticket that it will not win, then you should believe that none of them will win. But you also know with certainty that exactly one ticket will win. This is a stipulated fact of the lottery, and so you believe both that no ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these beliefs are contradictory, and so you hold contradictory beliefs, which seems paradigmatically irrational. Yet each individual belief, the belief that ticket 1 will not win, the belief that ticket 2 will not win, and so on, seems perfectly rational, justified by the overwhelming probability. And so the lottery paradox forces a choice between accepting that rational belief can be inconsistent, rejecting closure of belief under conjunction, or denying that high probability is sufficient for rational belief. The paradox was articulated by Henry Kaiberg in the 1960s, and it has generated an enormous literature in epistemology with various proposed solutions and no clear consensus. And the paradox reveals deep tensions in our ordinary thinking about belief, knowledge, probability, and rationality. Tensions that cannot be easily resolved without giving up some cherished principles or intuitions. One response is to reject closure, to argue that rational belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe each of many propositions without rationally believing all of them together, especially when the propositions are probabilistic and the number of them is large. And this response aligns with the observation that the probability of a conjunction is the product of the probabilities of the conjuncts. And so even if each ticket has only a 1 in a million chance of winning, the probability that at least one ticket wins is certainty. And so there is a gap between the high probability of each individual proposition and the low probability of their conjunction. And this gap justifies believing each individual proposition while not believing their conjunction. Another response is to raise the threshold for rational belief, to argue that high probability is not sufficient for belief, that belief requires something stronger, perhaps near certainty or probability, above some higher threshold, like 99% or 99.9%. And if we raise the threshold high enough, then it will no longer be rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win, because the probability that it will not win, while high, is not high enough to meet the raised threshold. And so the paradox dissolves, because the initial premise that it is rational to believe of each ticket that it will not win is rejected. A third response distinguishes between degrees of belief or credence and full belief, arguing that we should assign high credence to the proposition that ticket 1 will not win, perhaps 99.9999%, but we should not fully believe it. And full belief is reserved for propositions that meet a higher standard, perhaps certainty or near certainty. And this response preserves the intuition that high probability matters for rationality, while avoiding the paradox by denying that high probability justifies full belief. Still another response embraces a kind of rational inconsistency, arguing that in certain situations it is rational to hold inconsistent beliefs, that consistency is not an absolute requirement of rationality, that the world is complex and uncertain, and our beliefs must reflect that uncertainty, even if it means tolerating some inconsistency. And this response aligns with the preface paradox, where an author rationally believes each claim in a book while rationally believing that not. All the claims are true, and both paradoxes suggest that closure of belief under conjunction is too strong a requirement, that it demands a kind of logical perfection that finite agents in uncertain environments cannot achieve. The lottery paradox also connects to debates about the nature of knowledge, because it seems clear that you do not know that ticket 1 will not win, even though you have excellent evidence for believing it. And this suggests that knowledge requires something more than justified true belief, perhaps a safety condition. The requirement that in nearby possible worlds where you believe PP is true, and in the lottery case there are nearby worlds where the lottery is run fairly and ticket one wins, in which your belief that ticket one will not win is false, and so your belief fails the safety condition and does not constitute knowledge, even if it happens to be true. The paradox has practical implications as well, because we constantly make decisions based on beliefs that have high but not maximal probability. We believe that the plane will not crash, that the medicine will work, that the bridge will not collapse, and in each case there is a small probability that our belief is false. Yet we act on these beliefs. We board the plane, take the medicine, cross the bridge, and if we refuse to believe or act on anything less than certainty, we would be paralyzed, unable to function in a world of uncertainty. And so, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a reflection of the epistemic situation we constantly face, the need to navigate between skepticism and credulity, between demanding too much certainty and accepting too little, between the logical ideal of perfect consistency and the practical necessity of acting on incomplete information. The million tickets sit in the urn, one will win, the others will lose, and reason seems to say both that we should believe of each that it will lose, and that we should not believe that all will lose. And this contradiction, or apparent contradiction, has no easy resolution, no solution that preserves all intuitions and principles. And so the paradox remains a permanent challenge to theories of rational belief, a puzzle that forces philosophers to clarify what they mean by belief, by rationality, by justification, and to acknowledge that our ordinary concepts, when pressed to their limits, reveal inconsistencies and tensions that may be ineliminable features of finite cognition rather than problems to be solved. And the lottery continues, the tickets are drawn, one wins, the others lose, and we believe what we must believe, what rationality seems to demand, even when those beliefs, taken together, lead to contradiction. And the paradox endures, a monument to the gap between logical perfection and epistemic reality, between what we ought to believe in principle and what we must believe in practice. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism, the requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lude, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lude reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lude reads it while Prude does not. And Lude has opposite preferences. Most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lude thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lude is that Lude reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lude should be decisive over whether Lude reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lude chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lude reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lude does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges: respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare, and Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. Both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative. But that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck, cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise, then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter, and this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated, even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good, and in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid, and this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and Lude exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles, but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The non-identity problem, why creating a disabled child, seems wrong but harms no one. A woman takes medication that she knows will cause her future child to be born with a disability that will significantly reduce the child's quality of life, but will not make life so bad that it is not worth living, and the child will live with chronic pain, with limited mobility, with challenges that most people do not face. But the child will still experience joy and love and meaning, and life will be worth living overall, just harder, just less good than it could have been. And we are inclined to say that the woman did something wrong, that she should have stopped taking the medication, should have waited until it cleared her system before conceiving. And if she had waited, she would have conceived a different child, a healthy child. And this seems like the obviously right choice, but Now philosopher Derek Parfit poses a troubling question. Who exactly was harmed by the woman's choice? Who was made worse off? And the answer is puzzling because the disabled child cannot claim to have been harmed. Because if the woman had waited and conceived a different child, then this particular child would not exist at all, and the disabled child's only alternative to existing with a disability is not existing. And existing with a disability, as long as life is worth living, is better than not existing. And so the disabled child is not worse off, is actually better off for existing. And if no one was harmed, then how can the action be wrong? And this is the non-identity problem, a puzzle about how to ground judgments of wrongness in cases where the identity of affected individuals depends on the choices being evaluated. Imagine the scenario more carefully. At time 1, the woman is taking medication, and she has a choice: conceive now and have a disabled child, or wait a month, stop the medication, and conceive a healthy child. And suppose she chooses to conceive now, and 9 months later, a child is born with a disability. Call this child Alex, and Alex grows up facing challenges, but also experiencing good things. And on balance, Alex is glad to be alive, prefers existing to not existing. And now we ask whether the woman wronged Alex, whether Alex was harmed by the woman's choice. And the problem is that the alternative was not Alex without the disability. The alternative was a different child entirely, because different sperm and egg would have united if the woman had waited, and different genetic material produces a different person. And so Alex's options were either exist with the disability or not exist at all. And Alex is better off existing with the disability than not existing. And so how can Alex complain? How can Alex say the woman wronged them, when the only other possibility is non-existence? And if Alex cannot complain, then who can? And if no one can complain, then in what sense was the action wrong? The problem generalizes beyond this specific case. It arises whenever a choice affects who will exist rather than merely affecting how existing people will fare. And these cases are called non-identity cases, and they include decisions about environmental policy, where current generations choose between policies that affect which future people will exist. Decisions about genetic engineering, where parents choose traits for children who would not exist without that choice. Decisions about timing of reproduction, where different times lead to different children. And in all these cases, the people affected by the choice cannot claim they would have been better off if a different choice had been made, because they would not have existed if a different choice had been made. And so, standard harm-based reasoning seems to fail, seems unable to explain why these choices might be wrong. Visualize the problem as a branching tree. At the decision point, 2 branches extend. On one branch, a child with disability exists. On the other branch, a different healthy child exists. And we compare the 2 branches and say the second is better, produces a better outcome, a healthier child, less suffering, more well-being. But when we try to say who benefits from choosing the second branch, we cannot point to anyone. The disabled child does not benefit, because that child does not exist in the second branch. The healthy child does not benefit, because that child does not exist in the first branch. And so, there is no person who is made better off by choosing the better branch. And this seems to undermine the claim that the better outcome is better for anyone. And yet we strongly feel that the choice matters, that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong. Parfit proposed the non-identity problem as a challenge to person-affecting principles. Principles that say an action is wrong only if it makes someone worse off. And these principles work well for ordinary cases where the same people exist regardless of the choice, but they fail for non-identity cases where different choices lead to different people existing. And if we want to maintain that choices in non-identity cases can be wrong, we must adopt impersonal principles, principles that evaluate outcomes based on total or average well-being, or some other measure that does not depend on comparing how well-off particular individuals are across different choices. But impersonal principles face their own difficulties. They can imply things like the repugnant conclusion. They can recommend creating vast populations with minimal welfare, and they can conflict with intuitions about person-relative reasons and obligations. One response to the non-identity problem is to reject the claim that wrongness requires harming someone, to argue that some actions are wrong, even though they do not make anyone worse off, and creating a child with an avoidable disability is wrong. Not because it harms the child, but because it fails to give the child the best start in life, violates a duty to create the best children we can, and this response requires specifying what duties we have regarding procreation, what standards of care apply to potential children, and whether these duties are owed to specific individuals or are impersonal obligations about making the world better. Another response is to argue that the disabled child is harmed after all, harmed relative to an appropriate baseline, and the baseline is not non-existence, but rather the life the child could have had if different choices had been made, even though those choices would have resulted in a different child. We can still say that creating a child with avoidable disability is wrong because it brings into existence someone whose life contains avoidable suffering. And this suffering is bad even if it does not make anyone worse off compared to any alternative where that same person exists. And this response requires defending an impersonal notion of harm. Harm that is not comparative, not based on counterfactuals about specific individuals, but based on the presence of bad states like suffering. A third response is to bite the bullet and accept that the action is not wrong, that if no one is harmed, then nothing bad has happened. And this response embraces person-affecting principles and accepts their implications even in non-identity cases, admits that we cannot say the woman wronged the disabled child, cannot say she should have waited, and while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps our intuitions are wrong, perhaps we are confused about non-identity cases, and the theoretical clarity of person-affecting principles outweighs the cost of accepting counterintuitive conclusions. The non-identity problem has practical implications for reproductive ethics, for decisions about genetic screening, prenatal testing, selective abortion, and genetic modification, because many of these decisions are non-identity cases where choosing one option means one child exists, and choosing another means a different child exists. And if we cannot say these choices harm anyone, then it becomes difficult to regulate them. Difficult to say parents have obligations about which children to create. And yet most people feel strongly that some procreative choices are wrong, that parents should not knowingly create children with serious avoidable disabilities, that we have reasons to prefer healthy children, and these feelings need grounding, need principles that explain why these choices matter, even though no particular person is made worse off. The woman stands at the choice point, medication in hand, and she can conceive now or wait, can create a child with disability or create a different healthy child, and the choice seems obvious. And yet when we try to justify the obvious answer, try to explain why waiting is better, the justification becomes elusive, slips through our fingers, because no one is harmed by conceiving now. The child who exists is glad to exist, and the child who would exist if she waited does not exist to be disappointed. And the non-identity problem reveals a gap in our moral thinking, a case where our judgments are clear, but our reasons are unclear, where standard moral frameworks fail to explain intuitions we hold strongly, and Parfit's problem remains unsolved, challenging, forcing recognition that identity matters, that who exists matters, and that moral philosophy has not yet developed adequate tools for handling cases where choices determine who exists rather than merely how well existing people fare, and the problem persists, technical and troubling, a reminder that even procreation, the most basic of human activities, raises profound ethical puzzles that resist easy answers. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself, a sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox. a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration: "This statement is false," and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they're grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought. And sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The Monty Hall problem. A game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one is a valuable prize, a car perhaps, and behind the other 2 are less desirable outcomes, goats or some other consolation, and the contestant chooses a door, say, door number 1, but before the chosen door is opened, the host, who knows what is behind each door, opens one of the other doors, revealing a goat, and now 2 doors remain closed. The one the contestant originally chose, and one other, and the host offers a choice: stick with the original selection or switch to the other unopened door, and the question that has baffled and frustrated countless people is simple. Does it matter? Is there an advantage to switching? And the answer, counterintuitive as it seems, is yes. Switching doubles the probability of winning, changing the odds from 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. And this result violates most people's intuitions. Seems wrong? Feels like it cannot be right? Yet it is mathematically certain. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of the American television game show Let's Make a Deal, a puzzle, improbability that reveals how poorly human intuition handles conditional probability and how easily we can be misled by seemingly simple scenarios. The reasoning behind the correct answer goes as follows. When the contestant first chooses a door, the probability that the prize is behind that door is 1 in 3, and the probability that it is behind one of the other 2 doors is 2 in 3. And this much is uncontroversial. But when the host opens one of the other doors and reveals a goat, showing that the prize is not behind that door, the probabilities do not redistribute evenly among the remaining doors. The original choice still has a 1 in 3 probability of being correct because the host's action did not change the fact that the contestant's initial choice was made with 1 in 3 odds. But the other unopened door now has a 2 in 3 probability because the 2 in 3 chance that was distributed across the 2 unchosen doors is now concentrated in the single remaining door, and so switching to that door doubles the chance of winning. The intuition that misleads most people is the idea that once one door is opened and eliminated, there are 2 doors left, and the prize is equally likely to be behind either, giving a 50-50 chance regardless of whether you switch. But this reasoning ignores the information provided by the host's action, the fact that the host deliberately chose to open a door with a goat. And this deliberate choice is not random, it is constrained by knowledge. The host cannot open the door with the prize and will not open the door the contestant chose. And so the host's action provides information that updates the probabilities in a non-obvious way. A useful way to see why switching is advantageous is to imagine a version of the game with 1,000,000 doors. The contestant chooses one door, which has a 1 in a million chance of having the prize, and then the host opens 999,998 of the other doors, all showing goats, leaving only the contestant's original choice and one other door. And now it seems clear that the contestant's original choice, made with 1 in a million odds, is almost certainly wrong. And the remaining door, the one the host carefully avoided opening, is almost certainly the one with the prize, and switching gives a 999,999 in a million chance of winning. And the same principle applies with 3 doors, just with less dramatic numbers. The Monty Hall problem has been a source of controversy and heated debate, even among mathematicians and statisticians. And when Marilyn Vos Savant, a columnist known for her high IQ, published the correct answer in her magazine column in 1990, she received thousands of letters, many from PhD holders and professionals, insisting she was wrong. And the controversy revealed how deeply counterintuitive the solution is, how resistant people are to accepting it even when presented with mathematical proof. And this resistance reflects broader features of human cognition. The tendency to rely on heuristics and intuitions that work well in most everyday situations, but fail in probabilistic scenarios involving conditional information. The problem also illustrates the importance of conditioning in probability, the fact that probabilities must be updated in light of new information, and that the way information is acquired matters. The host's knowledge and deliberate choice of which door to open is crucial to the solution. If the host opened a door randomly and happened to reveal a goat, then the probabilities would indeed be 50-50. But because the host knows and deliberately avoids the prize door, the situation is different. And this distinction between random and informed selection is subtle and easy to miss. The Monty Hall problem has applications beyond game shows. It appears in medical testing, in legal reasoning, in machine learning, anywhere that probabilities must be updated based on partial information. And understanding the logic of the Monty Hall problem helps clarify how to reason correctly in these more consequential contexts, how to avoid fallacies, how to properly incorporate evidence into probability assessments. The problem also raises questions about the psychology of probability, about why people find certain probabilistic reasoning so difficult. And experiments have shown that even after being told the correct answer and shown simulations that demonstrate it, many people remain skeptical, unable to shake the intuition that switching makes no difference. And this persistence of false intuition despite evidence, suggests that probabilistic thinking is not natural to humans, that we evolved in environments where simple heuristics like equiprobability were sufficient, and that the kind of careful conditional reasoning required by the Monty Hall problem is a learned skill that requires training and practice. The doors stand closed, one hides the prize, the host knows which. The contestant chooses. The host opens a door, reveals a goat, and offers the choice. And the decision, which seems inconsequential, which feels like a coin flip, is actually a test of probabilistic reasoning, a puzzle that most people get wrong, that defies intuition, that reveals the gap between how we think probability works and how it actually works. And the Monty Hall problem endures, a staple of probability courses, a cautionary tale about trusting intuition, a reminder that the world is full of situations where the obvious answer is wrong, where careful analysis reveals unexpected structure, where what seems like chance is actually determined by hidden information, and the contestant who switches, who overcomes intuition and follows the mathematics, walks away with the prize twice as often, and the contestant who sticks with the original choice, trusting gut instinct, wins only a third of the time. And the difference, the doubling of odds, is not a trick or a gimmick, but a genuine feature of how conditional probability operates, and the problem persists, puzzling new generations, frustrating those who encounter it, illuminating those who understand it. A small puzzle with large implications. A game show scenario that contains lessons about reasoning, evidence, and the limits of human intuition. The McGurk effect. Why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable "baha," and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for ga, and yet what the person hears is neither ba nor ga, but da, a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976, a robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information, and vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original bar sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception, and the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying ga while the audio plays ba, and you hear da, not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion, and you know the audio is bea, can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open you hear da, vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear bay and see gay separately, but only experience the integrated da. The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. and this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying gyar and hear br, the brain computes that die is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality-specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it. And the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious, is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing, and the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says bar, sees the lips say gar, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources and the fusion continues. Da heard when Ba was spoken and Ga was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, and this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox. A paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all? And the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained. Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking. And the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained, that the question why something, rather than nothing, has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything, and so there can be no explanation for the totality, and so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts, and if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, and we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation, and if existence requires no explanation, then the question why something rather than nothing has no answer is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all, and from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being, and the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. An absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something. And so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are, Existence is actual. Something exists, and this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason, and this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. And various arguments have been offered for necessary existence, arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. And these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations. And each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy. And the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer, and we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life, and the question, echoes. Why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground. And the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble. A paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation. And the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with. And this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character, seek, and so on infinitely, and the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses, and with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. And this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely, and this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences, and none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, And so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands, stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions, reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence, and the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma, because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory. And this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it, and God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete, and then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence, and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice. And both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense, and the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence, and the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action, and different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God, and the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts, and the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The omniscience paradox. Can God know what it's like to not know everything? A theologian declares that God is omniscient, all-knowing, possessing complete and perfect knowledge of everything that can be known, every fact, every truth, every possibility, past, present, and future. And this claim seems straightforward, seems like a natural attribute of a perfect being, and yet a puzzle emerges when we consider what omniscience includes, whether it encompasses not just propositional knowledge, facts that can be stated as true or false, but also experiential knowledge, the knowledge of what something feels like, what it is like to undergo certain experiences. And the paradox asks whether God knows what it is like to not know something, whether God understands the experience of ignorance, confusion, discovery, learning, and if God does know what ignorance feels like, then God must have experienced ignorance. But if God has experienced ignorance, then God was not always omniscient, and if God cannot know what ignorance feels like, then there is something God does not know. And either way, omniscience seems incomplete, seems to have gaps, and this is the omniscience paradox, a puzzle about whether complete knowledge includes knowledge of incomplete knowledge, whether knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know. Imagine God trying to understand human experience, trying to grasp what it feels like to be confused, to search for answers, to wonder whether something is true, to make mistakes, to learn, to have that moment of insight when understanding suddenly clicks into place after struggling. And these experiences seem to require not knowing, seem to be essentially experiences of ignorance or partial knowledge. And if God has never been ignorant, has always known everything, then God has never had these experiences, has never felt what it is like to learn. And so there is an aspect of human experience that God cannot fully understand, cannot know from the inside, and this suggests that omniscience, defined as knowing everything, is actually impossible, because knowing everything includes knowing what it is like to not know everything, and these two forms of knowledge are incompatible, cannot both be had by the same being at the same time. The paradox connects to philosophical debates about the nature of knowledge, about whether there are different kinds of knowledge that cannot be reduced to each other, propositional knowledge, knowing that something is true, and experiential knowledge, knowing what something is like. And the distinction is illustrated by cases like colour perception. A person who has never seen red, but knows all the physical facts about red light, about wavelengths and retinal responses and neural processing, does not know what red looks like, does not have experiential knowledge of redness. And when they see red for the first time, they learn something new. And this suggests that experiential knowledge is distinct from propositional knowledge, cannot be obtained just by knowing facts. And if this is right, then God's omniscience, if it is purely propositional, misses something, misses the experiential dimension. And God does not know what it is like to see red for the first time, does not know what it is like to learn, does not know what ignorance feels like. Visualize the problem as a conflict between two divine attributes: omniscience, which requires always having known everything, and perfect empathy or understanding, which requires knowing what human experiences feel like from the inside. And human experiences include experiences of not knowing, and so perfect understanding seems to require having been ignorant. But omniscience seems to exclude ever being ignorant, and the two attributes pull in opposite directions, and something must give. Either God is not omniscient in the full experiential sense, or God does not fully understand human experience, or the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge is mistaken, and God can know what ignorance feels like without ever being ignorant, through some superior form of knowledge that encompasses both facts and feelings. One theological response is to argue that God's knowledge is sui generis, is of a different kind than human knowledge, and God knows what ignorance is like, not by experiencing it, but by knowing its nature completely, by understanding all its causes and effects and phenomenal properties, and this understanding is so complete that it counts as knowing what ignorance is like, even though God has never been ignorant. And this response tries to bridge the gap between propositional and experiential knowledge, tries to say that sufficiently complete propositional knowledge includes experiential knowledge, but critics argue that this misses the point, that no amount of knowing facts about an experience captures what the experience is like, that there is an irreducible, subjective aspect that can only be known by having the experience, and so God's propositional knowledge, however complete, does not include experiential knowledge of ignorance. Another response is to embrace kenosis, the theological idea that God voluntarily limits divine attributes, and this view says that God can and does experience ignorance, that in becoming incarnate, in taking human form as Christ, God experienced human limitations, including not knowing things, and the gospel accounts support this, showing Jesus learning, growing in wisdom, not knowing when the end times would come. And this shows that God can experience ignorance without ceasing to be God, that omniscience is not essential to divinity, but is a power that can be set aside. And this resolves the paradox by denying that God is always omniscient, accepting that there are times when God voluntarily limits divine knowledge. But this creates new puzzles about whether a being that is not always omniscient can be called omniscient, and whether divine attributes can be temporary. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of ignorance, between merely not knowing a fact which God never experiences, and the phenomenology of searching for knowledge, the feeling of curiosity and discovery, which God might be able to simulate or understand through analogical reasoning, and God knows what it would be like to be in a state of ignorance, even though God is never actually in such a state. Just as someone who has never been to Mars might know what it would be like through detailed scientific knowledge and imagination, and this response tries to preserve both omniscience and experiential understanding by making experiential knowledge a form of imaginative or counterfactual knowledge. But again, critics argue that simulating or imagining an experience is not the same as having it, that there is a difference between knowing what it would be like and knowing what it is like, and God's simulated ignorance is not real ignorance and does not provide the experiential knowledge that the paradox concerns. The omniscience paradox also raises questions about divine immutability, the claim that God does not change, because if God learns or discovers anything, then God changes, gains knowledge that was previously lacking, and this violates immutability, and so perfect knowledge seems to require having always known everything, never learning, never being surprised, and yet this static, eternal knowledge seems incompatible with understanding temporal beings who do learn and are surprised, and reconciling omniscience and immutability with understanding human experience remains a challenge for classical theology. The paradox extends beyond ignorance to other experiential states. Does God know what it is like to be tempted, to feel desire for something forbidden, to struggle with moral choice? And if God is perfectly good, necessarily good, then God cannot be genuinely tempted, cannot feel the pull of evil, and so there is an aspect of human moral experience that God cannot know from the inside, and this creates distance between divine and human experience, suggests that God's understanding of humanity is necessarily incomplete, necessarily limited by God's perfection, and this is ironic, that God's perfection prevents complete understanding, that to fully know what it is like to be human, God would have to be imperfect, would have to experience weakness and ignorance and temptation, and these are incompatible with divine perfection. Some theologians embrace this limitation, argue that God's knowledge is perfect for a perfect being, but does not include the experiential knowledge of imperfection. And this is not a defect but a feature, a reflection of God's nature. And just as we do not think a perfect circle is defective because it is not a square, we should not think God is defective because God does not know what ignorance feels like, because such knowledge is incompatible with perfection. And the paradox assumes that all knowledge is good and more knowledge is always better. But perhaps some kinds of knowledge are only available through imperfection, and lacking them is not a limitation but a consequence of being perfect. Others reject omniscience entirely, argue that it is an incoherent concept, that complete knowledge is impossible, that there are always things that cannot be known, experiential states that require imperfection, future free choices that are not yet determined, logical truths that exceed any finite or infinite mind's capacity to grasp all at once. And if omniscience is impossible, then God is not omniscient, but this does not diminish God, does not make God less than perfect, because perfection means having all attributes that it is possible to have, not having impossible attributes. And omniscience, like omnipotence, when examined carefully, turns out to be impossible. And so God is not omniscient, but maximally knowledgeable, knows everything that can be known, and this is sufficient for divinity. God stands outside time, knowing all facts, all truths, all possibilities, and yet there is a gap, an experiential gap. God does not know what it feels like to search, to wonder, to be wrong, to learn. And whether this gap is a limitation or a feature remains contested, and the omniscience paradox persists, challenging the coherence of divine attributes, forcing clarification of what knowledge means, what kinds of knowledge exist, and whether complete knowledge is even possible. And the paradox remains unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a reminder that even the most basic divine attributes, even the claim that God knows everything, conceal complexities and contradictions that philosophy continues to explore. The paradox of confirmation. Why seeing a red apple proves all ravens are black. A scientist seeks to confirm the hypothesis that all ravens are black, and the obvious way to test this hypothesis is to observe ravens, to find ravens and check their colour. And each black raven found provides evidence for the hypothesis, confirms it slightly, makes it more likely to be true. And this seems straightforward, seems like basic scientific method. Observe instances that match the hypothesis and they provide confirmation. But philosopher Carl Hempel noticed something strange, something that reveals how confirmation works in unexpected ways. And the strangeness begins with a logical equivalence. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to the statement, all non-black things are non-ravens. These two statements have exactly the same truth conditions. If one is true, then the other must be true. If one is false, then the other must be false. And so anything that confirms one statement should confirm the other, should provide equal evidence for both. But now consider what confirms the statement. All non-black things are non-ravens, and observing a non-black non-raven should confirm it. Observing a red apple provides evidence that all non-black things are non-ravens because a red apple is non-black and is a non-raven. And since all non-black things are non-ravens is equivalent to all ravens are black, observing a red apple should confirm that all ravens are black. And this seems absurd. Seems like observing apples in your kitchen has nothing to do with the colour of ravens. And yet the logic is impeccable. And this is the paradox of confirmation, also called Hempel's paradox or the raven paradox. A puzzle about how evidence works, about what confirms scientific hypotheses, and about whether our intuitions about confirmation can be trusted. Imagine a scientist sitting in a laboratory surrounded by red apples, carefully noting each one, recording that it is red and not a raven, and claiming that this investigation provides evidence about ravens, evidence that all ravens are black. And this seems ridiculous. Seems like the scientist has confused what is relevant to the hypothesis, has mistaken irrelevant observations for genuine evidence, and yet the logical structure is clear. Each red apple confirms that all non-black things are non-ravens, and this statement is logically equivalent to all ravens are black. And confirmation should be closed under logical equivalence. If observation O confirms hypothesis H, and H is equivalent to H, then O should confirm H out, otherwise confirmation would depend on how we phrase hypotheses rather than on what they say. And so the scientist with the red apples is doing legitimate science, is confirming a hypothesis about ravens even though no ravens are involved. And the paradox forces us to either accept this counterintuitive conclusion or reject some principle we thought was obvious about how confirmation works. The paradox reveals tension between formal logic and intuitive judgment. Because formally the argument is valid, red apples do confirm that all ravens are black through the equivalence with all non-black things are non-ravens, but intuitively this seems wrong. Seems like red apples are irrelevant to ravens, and resolving this tension requires either explaining why the formal conclusion is actually correct and our intuitions are misleading, or showing where the formal argument goes wrong, where a principle we thought was valid actually fails. And both options have been pursued, have generated extensive philosophical literature, have produced multiple proposed solutions, none of which has won universal acceptance. Visualize the logical space of all objects, divided into 4 categories: black ravens, which confirm the hypothesis directly; non-black ravens, which would falsify the hypothesis; black non-ravens like coal or blackboards, which seem irrelevant; and non-black non-ravens like red apples, which also seem irrelevant. And the paradox says that observing objects in the 4th category, non-black non-ravens, provides evidence for the hypothesis that all ravens are black, because these observations confirm the equivalent hypothesis that all non-black things are non-ravens, and each red apple, each green leaf, each blue car provides a tiny bit of evidence that ravens are black. And while this sounds absurd, it follows from principles of confirmation that seem undeniable. One proposed solution appeals to background knowledge and prior probabilities, argues that red apples do confirm that all ravens are black, but the confirmation is so tiny as to be practically negligible. Because we have vast background knowledge about the number of non-black things in the universe, we know there are billions and billions of non-black objects, and observing one red apple increases our confidence that all non-black things are non-ravens by an infinitesimal amount, whereas we have much less background knowledge about ravens, and observing one black raven increases our confidence that all ravens are black by a larger amount. And so both observations provide confirmation, but in vastly different degrees. And this explains why it seems pointless to observe red apples when investigating raven colour. Not because they provide no confirmation, but because they provide so little confirmation that the exercise is worthless. And this Bayesian solution preserves the formal logic while explaining the intuition, accepts that red apples confirm the hypothesis, but explains why we correctly ignore them. Another solution challenges the equivalence condition, argues that confirmation is not closed under logical equivalence, that logically equivalent statements can receive different confirmation from the same observation. And the reason is that confirmation depends not just on logical form, but on the way hypotheses are stated, on which predicates are used, on how the hypothesis carves up the world, and all ravens are black, and all non-black things are non-ravens, while logically equivalent, organise the world differently, make different predicates primary, and observations confirm hypotheses relative to these organisations, and a black raven confirms the first hypothesis more than the second, and a red apple confirms the second more than the first, even though they are equivalent. And this solution rejects the principle that equivalent hypotheses must receive equal confirmation from the same observation. A third solution appeals to selective confirmation, argues that observing a red apple provides some evidence for all ravens are black, but only under certain conditions, only when the observation is made in a context where it has the potential to falsify the hypothesis, and seeing a red apple in your kitchen where you never expected to find a raven provides no confirmation, provides no new information, but seeing a red apple in a context where you might have found a non-black raven, where the observation had the potential to reveal a counterexample, does provide confirmation. And so confirmation depends not just on what is observed, but on the circumstances of observation, on what was at stake, on what alternatives were possible. And this solution ties confirmation to potential falsification, treats confirmation as depending on whether observations eliminate possibilities rather than merely matching hypotheses. The paradox also connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's problem of how we can justify inferring from observed instances to unobserved cases, because confirming all ravens are black by observing black ravens assumes that the future will resemble the past, that unobserved ravens will be like observed ravens, and this assumption itself cannot be justified without circularity. And the paradox adds another layer, shows that even if we accept induction, we face puzzles about what counts as confirming evidence, about whether observations of non-ravens can tell us about ravens, and these puzzles reveal that confirmation is more complex than it appears, cannot be reduced to simple pattern matching or accumulation of positive instances. The scientist with the red apples continues recording, carefully noting each observation, and the paradox hangs over the investigation, a question about whether this absurd procedure is actually legitimate science, whether red apples really do provide evidence about ravens, and the answer depends on how we understand confirmation, on which principles we accept, on whether we follow formal logic or intuitive judgment, and the paradox remains unresolved in the sense that different solutions appeal to different intuitions, make different trade-offs, and no consensus has emerged, only a recognition that confirmation is subtle, that evidence works in non-obvious ways, that formal principles can lead to counterintuitive conclusions, and that the relationship between observation and theory, between data and hypothesis, between evidence and confirmation, is more complex than common sense suggests, and Hempel's paradox endures as a classic problem in philosophy of science, a puzzle that continues to challenge our understanding of scientific method, a reminder that even basic concepts like confirmation and evidence conceal difficulties that philosophy has not fully resolved. The paradox of democracy, when majority rule destroys itself. A democratic society values freedom and equality, gives every citizen voice, allows majority rule to determine policy, and this seems just, seems fair, seems like the best system for governance. And yet democracy contains internal tensions, contains paradoxes that threaten its stability, and one fundamental paradox asks, what democracy should do when the majority votes to end democracy? When the people use democratic procedures to elect authoritarian leaders who promise to dismantle democratic institutions? And if democracy respects majority, will it must allow this outcome, must permit its own destruction? But if democracy forbids this outcome, prevents the majority from choosing authoritarianism, then it violates its own principles, acts undemocratically. And this is the paradox of democracy, the recognition that democracy's commitment to majority rule can lead to outcomes that destroy democracy itself. And navigating this paradox requires balancing competing values, requires defending democracy sometimes against democratic procedures, requires recognizing that procedural democracy is not sufficient, that substantive commitments to rights and freedoms are necessary to preserve democracy. And this paradox has been central to political philosophy since ancient times. Was recognized by Plato, who argued that democracy tends toward tyranny, and the paradox remains relevant today as democratic societies face authoritarian movements that use democratic means to gain power. Imagine an election where an authoritarian party campaigns on promises to restrict freedoms, to eliminate checks and balances, to concentrate power, to end future elections, and this party wins a majority, wins through legitimate democratic procedures, through free and fair voting, and now the society faces a choice. Honour the election results and allow democracy to be dismantled, or override the results and preserve democracy by undemocratic means. And neither option is satisfactory. Both involve betraying core democratic values. And the paradox emerges from the fact that democracy values both procedural fairness and substantive freedoms. And these can conflict. Majority rule can threaten minority rights, can threaten the institutions that make democracy possible. And when conflict occurs, democracy faces an impossible choice. Preserve procedure or preserve substance, respect majority, will or defend fundamental freedoms. The paradox connects to Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, the recognition that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance, that tolerant societies must be intolerant of intolerance to survive. And the same structure applies to democracy. Unlimited democracy, democracy that respects all majority decisions regardless of content, leads to the disappearance of democracy. And democratic societies must be undemocratic toward anti-democratic movements to preserve democracy, and this creates the paradox. Democracy must violate its principles to preserve its principles, must act undemocratically to remain democratic. And this tension is permanent, is inherent in the structure of democracy, cannot be fully resolved, but must be managed through careful balancing of competing considerations. Visualize democracy as having two aspects: procedural democracy, which emphasizes voting, majority rule, fair elections, and substantive democracy, which emphasizes rights, freedoms, protections for minorities, and ideally these aspects reinforce each other. Procedures protect rights and rights enable procedures, but they can conflict. Procedures can be used to undermine rights, majorities can vote to restrict freedoms, and when conflict occurs, the society must choose which aspect to prioritize, and different societies make different choices. Constitutional democracies emphasize substantive protections, have constitutions that limit majority power, protect fundamental rights even against majority will, and these systems accept that democracy involves more than majority rule, involves commitments to principles that cannot be overridden by votes. And this resolves the paradox partially, makes democracy less purely procedural, more substantively constrained. One response to the paradox argues that true democracy is substantive, not procedural, that democracy is not just about voting, but about respecting rights, protecting minorities, ensuring freedom. And when these substantive commitments are threatened, even by majority vote, democracy requires defending them, requires overriding the majority. And this militant democracy, this democracy that defends itself against anti-democratic forces, is not a betrayal of democracy, but is its preservation, is necessary to maintain the conditions that make democracy possible. And historical examples support this. Societies that failed to restrict anti-democratic movements, that allowed authoritarians to use democratic procedures to gain power, lost their democracies, and hindsight suggests that early intervention, that militant defense would have been justified, would have preserved democracy even though it involved undemocratic means. Another response distinguishes between procedural rules and constitutional principles, argues that democracies should have entrenched principles that cannot be changed by ordinary procedures, that require supermajorities or constitutional amendments, and these entrenched principles include fundamental rights, democratic structures, and protections for minorities. And ordinary majorities can make policy within these constraints, but cannot override the principles themselves. And this response preserves both procedural and substantive democracy, allows majority rule within limits. And the paradox is resolved by recognizing that democracy is hierarchical, has constitutional principles at one level and democratic procedures at another, and procedures operate within the framework set by principles, and this framework is not itself subject to ordinary democratic revision. A third response embraces the paradox, accepts that democracy is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable to self-destruction, and argues that this vulnerability is a price worth paying for freedom, that the alternative, restricting democracy to protect democracy, is worse than the risk of democratic collapse. And this radical democratic response trusts in the people, trusts that majorities will not choose their own oppression, and when they do, the society pays the price. And this response is rare. Most societies are unwilling to risk democratic collapse, prefer to impose constraints on democracy, but the response represents one coherent position, one way of resolving the paradox by accepting its consequences. The paradox also appears in debates about hate speech, about whether democracies should allow speech that advocates for the destruction of democracy, speech that promotes authoritarianism or discrimination. And free speech is a democratic value, is protected in democratic societies. But speech that aims to destroy democracy creates the paradox, and banning such speech seems undemocratic, seems to violate free expression, but allowing it risks democracy's survival. And different democracies resolve this differently. Some ban anti-democratic speech, some allow it, and no resolution is without costs. All involve trade-offs between competing values. The election results are counted, the authoritarian party has won, and the democratic society faces the paradox: honour the results and risk losing democracy, or override the results and betray democratic procedures. And the choice is not theoretical, is faced by real societies, has been faced throughout history, and different societies have chosen differently. Some have preserved democracy by undemocratic means, some have respected procedures and lost democracy, and the paradox remains unresolved, remains a permanent tension in democratic governance. A challenge that every democracy must navigate, must balance procedure against substance, must defend itself without betraying itself. And the paradox of democracy endures as a fundamental problem in political philosophy, a recognition that democracy contains contradictions, that majority rule can lead to minority oppression, that freedom can be voted away, and that preserving democracy sometimes requires limiting democracy, and the tension persists. The balance is delicate, and the paradox remains unsolved, a permanent feature of democratic life. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed. And so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism. The argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming. And if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Peerboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic, inheritance, and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Peerboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility. makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible, challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters, and compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization. And this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility. And the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will.